Whilst fishing, we are surrounded in this part of the world by history, which we're probably not even aware of. Going all the way back to the Roman occupation. And this video, which is the 12th in this series, it looks at the history which I've come across when out fishing. At the top of the Leeds Dassa Eastlake stretch of the River Wharfe, where the Roman road Rudgate crosses the river on its way from Hazelwood to Wixley via Cattal, there was a ford. In medieval times it was called St Helens Fort, but it probably was originally Roman, which goes across the River Wharfe. And in the field to the south there was a Roman camp and a fort to protect this important crossing, and it was probably a port as well. This is an aerial view showing the outline of the fort, though the camp was much bigger. You can see Rudgate and St Helens Ford. There's a Roman road. When I went down it in my car, I don't think they'd done anything to it since the Romans left. It was absolutely dreadful. Now there's a gate on to stop you going along there in a car, if you were mad enough. But in the field there, just on the right of the road, you can see the outline of a Roman fort. And there was a big camp surrounding it. When you go in there fishing, you don't really notice it. You can only really see it from the air. When fishing at the Eastlake on the right bank, there's a mound in the fields opposite.
Kings of the castle.
There you can see the mound at Osbourne Beck Castle. Just not lost the rod here. But, ignore that. This was once the main home of the most powerful family in the north of England, the Percys. William de Percy, he funded William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066, and he arrived in England himself in 1067, 1 year after the Norman invasion. And following the 1069-1070 rebellion by the essentially Danish population in the north of England, and the brutal suppression by William the Conqueror, I mean, what they call the harrying of the north. He destroyed everything, buildings, killed everything, killed livestock, killed people, demolished crops. It was appalling. Anyway, William de Percy established himself at Topcliff as the first of 9 feudal barons of Topcliff, building a Motte Bailey castle, remains of which can be best seen from the air. And there is a view of Topcliff Maiden Castle, the Motte Bailey Castle. And you can see there on the left Codbecker, on the right is the River Swale. He died near Jerusalem on the First Crusade, and his heart was returned to Whitby Abbey, which he had helped to restore. And eventually a substantial moated stone fortified manor was built next to the fort, which was obviously a timber thing which wasn't going to last very long. In 1309, Henry de Percy who was the 5th feudal baron of Topcliff, bought Newark Castle from the Bishop of Durham and became the first Baron de Percy of Newark. And Newark Castle, it became their main house, and it remains so to this day. And in 1489, Henry de Percy, who was the 4th Earl of Northumberland, he was residing at Topcliff following his betrayal of the Yorkist Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field during the War of the Roses. All his estates were confiscated, but he'd just got them back from the victor, the Lancastrian and now King Henry VII. And the king needed money to fight the French, and Henry was instructed to collect these punitive taxes. He was very unpopular, having betrayed the House of York at Bosworth Field, and that combined with these taxes, a mob descended on Topcliff Castle, broke their way in and murdered him and several others. And his funeral was one of the largest ever seen in England. The cortege stretched for miles and miles as he was carried from Topcliff to Beverley Minster, where he's buried. And this is a photograph of his memorial or sarcophagus or whatever you want to call it. Well, I suppose his body isn't in it. Anyway, during the 15th century, the stone manor became a ruin, and all the stone was pinched for building all sorts of things, other houses and other walls. But the remains of the castle remained in the family until the 16th century. Just a little bit about King Richard III, who we've mentioned above. He spent his childhood at Middleham Castle. He wasn't born there, I don't think. He was sent there to learn knightly ways, and he was schooled in the art of knighthood by Sir Richard Neville, the owner of Middleham Castle, and several others, a very, very powerful man. And he didn't do much good. He was killed at Bosworth Field and lost his crown. He seemed to be a bit of a nasty character. He was involved in the Princes of the Tower, a sort of mystery which has never really been solved. This is Middleham Castle, surrounded by racehorse trainer stables, sort of Newmarket of the North, horses everywhere. Sort of closer view of what remains. That's just an aerial photograph of Middleham Castle. When you're travelling through Middleham, you don't actually see it, it's sort of round the back if you're going fishing at Middleham. When I'm travelling up from Marsham to Middleham, before I arrive, on the right hand side is Gervo Abbey. There's a view of Gervo Abbey, Wensleydale. It's lovely sunshine. The original abbey was established by Cistercian monks from France at Fours, which is just outside Ashrig, in 1145 AD. But it was a bleak, miserable place, and the crops kept failing. So after just 11 years, the monastery was moved down the dale to a far more pleasant place at East Whitton. Again, when you're driving from Mossam up to Fish at Middleham, you don't see this because it's behind a big wall, unless you're in a high vehicle. It's quite a long way off. But there it is on a nice day. When I was driving past taking video, it was blowing a howling gale, hence the wind noise. But it's a lovely place to visit, a nice evening or a nice afternoon. And of course there are tea rooms on the other side of the road. It was renowned for breeding horses, and it was the original producer of Wensleydale cheese, which it made from sheep's milk. And at one time the monastery owned half the dale, but fell foul, as did all religious establishments, fell foul of Henry VIII when he wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't give him it. And so the monastery was broken up in 1537 during the Reformation, and all its valuables were confiscated. And even worse, as the last abbot had joined the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was a rebellion against the king's break with Catholicism. The demolition was particularly severe, and it's quite difficult to appreciate just how large the monastery was from the remains which are still there. I mean, some parts of the monastery were carted off and used in churches in the area. I know Bedale Church has got a lovely window from Gervo Abbey. And a massive amount of lead, which they took off the roof. I mean, it was too heavy to cart away because of the poor weather. And it just stayed there for centuries. And following the fire in York Minster, this lead was discovered, and it was used to repair the roof after the fire in 1984. But Gervo Abbey has always been in private hands, and it's a delightful place to visit, being far less manicured than the better known monastic ruins like Fountains Abbey and Revo. Skipton Bridge crosses the River downstream of Middleham, and I've spent many wonderful evenings there, fly fishing downstream of the bridge. Isn't that lovely? It sits on top of a Roman fort. If you look into the water, you can see the iron bands that keep the stones together where this fort went across. It's Norman in date, and it was probably built by the monks of the newly established monastery at Gervo. But the notable thing about it is, apart from its wonderful stonework, is it rests on a remarkably well-preserved paved Roman ford, which you can easily see. It's like a pavement under the bridge, held together with sort of metal cleats. A legend surrounds its construction. Previous bridges having been swept away, the devil let it be known that he would build a substantial stone bridge on condition that he could have the soul of the first person he encountered on crossing the bridge when it had been completed. And as the bridge neared completion, there was consternation about who that person might be. But the problem was solved when somebody suggested that the bridge should never be completed. And to this day, which is 2021, a brick has always been missing. And you can see that here on this bit of video. So when the bridge was almost complete, we always left one of the stones off, so it was never finished. And they still do. If you look down there on that pillar, You can see there, there's a stone missing. So the bridge has never been finished, even when they renovated it. They left this store out. So the devils have never been able to cross it to get from the north to the south side. So the legend goes. When fishing at Bob's Island in Newark, I was facing the ruins of Newark Castle. And this is Newark Castle on a nice bright sunny day, taken from the footbridge, which when we were fishing from Bob's Island ran right across the middle of the, of the video. It was built in 1133 by the Bishop of Lincoln and remained under the influence of the church until 1547, when it was seized by the Crown. It was in Royalists' hands during the Civil War, but it surrendered to the Roundheads under Cromwell in 1646, and it was made uninhabitable. There was a word for it, I can't remember. Fortunately, it wasn't plundered for its stone like many of these places, and the ruins have been restored. I think it's now owned by the council, and the reflection in the mirror, it just adds to its glamour. It's a magnificent view in this early sunshine, evening sunshine, wonderful. Newark Castle on the pleasure boat. On the right bank of the River Swale, below Topcliff Weir, is a large stone abutment which sort of sticks out over the river, and it's often mistaken for the remains of a bridge. However, it's a remnant of a much grander scheme. There you can see one of the buttresses which supported the lock, Topcliff. The lock was in fact behind that. It's all been filled in. And there you can see the remains of the lock. I don't know when that was taken, 1960s perhaps. You can see the buttresses. One there, one there, one there, and there were two others along here, and they were used to prevent the lock from collapsing into the river. The lock was behind the buttresses. In 1767, an Act of Parliament approved the building of a navigation on the River Swale and Bedale Beck, linking Bedale with York, and a report had been prepared by the engineer John Grundy, which you can see here, or part of it. This is from John Grundy's report into the building of the Swale navigation. These are the sort of where the locks are going to be and the distance between them in miles and furlongs. And on the extreme right, how much each lock will raise a boat. So you can see the total rise from the mouth of the Swale up to Bedale Beck entrance. Well, the mouth of Bedale Beck is 53 feet 3 inches. And this is the scheme, or the report for the proposed Bedale Beck bit. The total rise would be 20 feet. It involved building 7 locks and associated works, ending in a harbour to be built at Bedale. This photograph is of Bedale Harbour. It finished in the pool below this weir. The weir provided water for Bedale Mill. And there was a great pound here where boats could be turned round. But now it's all been filled in. All this was part of the pound. But you can still see the rings there where the boats were to tie up had they ever arrived. And similarly at Thirsk, on the Codbeg extension up to Thirsk, in Thirsk you can see similar rings attached to a wall there, but again boats never arrived. It was proposed that a new mill and weir be included in the works at Topcliff. There was a mill which was upstream of the current one and on the opposite bank, almost opposite where Salmon Hall Farm is now. An early photograph of Topcliff Mill. Probably taken around the 1920s. Difficult to say. Probably earlier. Notice there are no trees behind on the road there, so it's probably around, maybe even earlier than that. And taken in winter time. The weir seems to be almost completely frozen. And flooding had always been a problem here, so in 1973, which was more than 100 years after the weir was built, and once the mill was closed, they took the top layer off the weir, so it's not as high today as it was then. After much trouble with floods and competition for navvies, because there were lots of these constructions going on all over the country, Topcliff Lock was opened in January 1769, and it was the first on the scheme, and 2 boats loaded with timber passed through the lock and were unloaded, I should say above there, above the weir. This is an aerial view of Topcliff Mill, and you can see the this was where the lock was. It's all filled in now, and the boats would have gone up this cut here to get above the weir. And that's what it looks like today. Bedale Beck was straightened out, Leeming Lock was completed, and Bedale Harbour awaited its first boat. Leckby Palace Lock was started but never completed as the scheme ran out of money. And then the coming of the railway killed the scheme off. When it tried to raise money to restart it, nobody was interested. And most of the materials, especially the timber and dressed stone, they were reclaimed by those who were owed money. Milling ceased in 1961, and in 1966 British Rail, who'd owned the mill since 1907, sold it to listers, who were the former millers, and they used the mill for agricultural purposes but not actual milling. But shortly afterwards they sold it on, and the house opposite the mill house, it was opened as a fisherman's lodgings for a short while before becoming an hotel and a restaurant. In the meantime, the mill itself was converted into a nightclub. I wonder how many can remember the Mills short-lived nightclub. I don't know where they all parked. And it was up till 2 a.m. and people complain about us night fishing now. This is an early photograph of Topcliff sheep wash, where the parish pegs are today. You see the left bank of the river is absolutely devoid of vegetation. Now it's a great mass of trees. Anyway, in 1990s the mill was converted into flats and the house became a private dwelling. Two stretches I occasionally fish are at Whitton and Skipton Swale. And in 1868 the Stapleton family, who were the owners of the estate, they replaced the ferry with a new bridge. When I first visited Whitton, I think it was in 1888, it was in an absolutely parlous state, as was Whitton Hall itself, and the whole estate really was a right mess. And the Stapleton coat of arms can be seen on the bridge. And this is Whitton Bridge in 1988, and you can see how the balustrade is all falling to bits. There were great chunks of it in the river. Before it was renovated in 2002. I mean, the estate was bought by Sir Ken Morrison of supermarket fame and completely restored. Absolutely beautiful. And in 2002 the bridge was also restored to its former glory, partially funded by the European Union. And this is it following its renovation. Just behind that pillar are the coat of arms of the family who lived at Whitton Hall and who had it built, the Stapleton family. This was their family home, which has been beautifully done at astronomical cost, I would imagine. There's a lovely plaque giving details about the bridge, and another about the Battle of Whitton, which took place in an adjacent field in 1309. Some Scots, emboldened by their victory at Bannockburn, beat off a force of Yorkshiremen, leaving many dead and drowned in the river. Whitton Bridge, when I first came down here, this was a complete ruin. Most of the balustrades were in the river, holes in the decking. It tells you a little bit about it here. A little bit. On the other side of the bridge is some information about the Battle of Whitton in the 14th century. It's Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn. After that, the Scots came down here and caused mayhem. Look at the information on it. The Scots are like that. Oh, that's very interesting. It's quite interestingly decorated as well. Knights in armour. In May 1943, the airfield at Skipton Swell began operations, and it was one of several hastily built on the Vale of York during World War II. And this is a photograph of Skipton Swale airfield in 1943, just after it opened up. It was a base for Bomber Command and manned by Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons, initially flying Wellingtons and Halifaxes, but then they were given Avro Lancasters either late in 1944 or early 1945. This is another Handley Page Halifax Bomber Mark III, again based at Leeming, flying over the North Yorkshire countryside. Again another Halifax bomber. Skipton Swale was a sort of substation for Leeming. This photograph was in fact taken at Leeming in front of a Halifax bomber called Gutsy Gertie. Another photograph taken at Skipton Swell, the Canadian air crew, with some dolly bird painted on the side. This photograph was taken in 1945, by which time they had been given Avro Lancaster bombers, which they're all proudly standing around. Again, was taken at Skipton Swale. The pubs and village hall dances reverberated with the sounds of young Canadian aircrew, risking their lives to keep us from the enemy, never knowing if their next raid over Germany would be their last. In October 1945, the airfield was closed and abandoned, almost overnight. The silence following the almost overnight departure of all these squadrons with the roar of their huge Merlin engines night after night, it must have been really surreal. Not to mention the fact that they weren't spending any money. However, on the village green at Skipton Swell, there's a memorial to those who served here. And this is a plaque on the green at Skipton Swale to all those who served at the airfield during the Second World War. I found it quite an eerie place to fish. So when I fished down there, I half expect to hear the sound of a returning bomber. And this is how it is in 2015. And if you're going fishing on the Leeds Dassa Stretch, you park there. When fishing on the River Ooze, I was intrigued by the sign on the left bank just downstream of Hunter's Lodge Farm. Well, this sign, which I photographed years ago, is still here. Much to my amazement. It may even be a new sign. But anyway, this is where the River Yore joins Ousgill Beck behind me and forms the River Ouse, which goes all the way down to the junction with the Trent, where the River Trent comes in, at which point it becomes the River Humber, or the Humber Estuary. If I just turn round, there you can see the River Yore, and over there, amongst that tangle of branches, is a floodgate to stop the river backing up Yrs Beck. You can't actually see it, but I'm assured there's one there. That big oak tree is. And down here, with the sun on it, is the River Ooze. Well, I find that amazing. And what the point, nobody can really explain how it came about. It seems to go back hundreds of years. I mean, some information says that the River Yore becomes the Ooze where it joins the River Swale at Whitton, which is about 6 miles upstream. But it's not true, and indeed on some maps below the River Swale Yore junction at Whitton, the river is marked on as the River Ooze, but it isn't. It's still the River Yore until it gets down to this. You wouldn't even know there was a beck over there coming into the river. Like many, I'd always thought that the Ooze began at Swale Nab, where the rivers Yore and Swale joined. Anyway, not so it would seem. And this is Swale Nab, where some people think the River Ooze begins here, where the Swale and the Ooze join, but it doesn't. It remains as the River Yore for about another 6 miles. Opposite this sign, and almost completely obscured, was a small stream running into the river, so I must have word out there. It's called Yrs Beck and runs through the grounds of Kirby Hall, where it had been dammed at some time to form a large lake, which is now almost completely silted up. And anyway, continuing upstream, the beck emerges in the garden of what was Osbourne Workhouse, and it's marked by a tall stone column engraved Ooze River Head, which looks sort of 18th century, probably put there by the family who owned the estate, who lived at Kirby Hall. This is the infirmary building at Great Osborne Union Workhouse. It's been used as housing. And if I just turn around, in the garden of this building is this big stone column. With inscriptions on it. And on this side it says Ooze River Head, although it's probably quite difficult to see. If I move around to this side, it says Gervo Bridge, 4 miles. And this side, it says Ooze Gill Spring. Complete it. This side it says go up 13 miles. and it's just standing here neglected. So this is the source of the River Ooze. There's a spring which actually seems to have been covered in, but it reappears in a field. And on the top it's got a spike. It's obviously had something, there's obviously been something extra on top of there. It's obviously fallen off. What a great shame, it's just sort of sitting here abandoned. One day whilst travelling through Great Osbourne, I noticed two large blue plaques on a wall facing up the road. And before I went down to Oldvark to fish, I went to have a look. Because I'd never seen them before, they weren't there before. And it was fascinating, as one of these plaques was in Russian. Not the sort of thing you expect to see in a North Yorkshire village. During the Second World War in 1942, there was obviously a secret flight taking place with Russian officers. They took off from Hendon in London, flew to Edinburgh, and on the way back, this de Havilland Flamingo aircraft crashed in a field behind Vine House in Great Osbourne. And there are two plaques on the wall here, which were put up in 2012. When all this came out, at the time, it was absolutely top secret. Everything was hushed up. So when the plane crashed, then security from Lyndon and Ooze RAF base arrived and no one was allowed near it. But what's quite interesting is that one of these plaques is in Russian. And there is the reason. And the Russians, they're buried in Harrogate's Stonefall Cemetery. And it was kept a top secret for 60 years, this, but suddenly some Russians in uniform came to have a look at these Russian graves in Harrogate Cemetery. And it sort of all came out. And these plaques were erected in, I think it was 2012. So there you have it. Whether you're actually fishing or travelling to or from your fishing, it's amazing what history there is around us here. Everything from the Romans right away through to the Second World War. Anyway, for now, see you again on the bank sometime. Take care. Bye-bye.